passion is in coalition building. I will restart my intro. So I got to know Kirsten at an event a few years ago in DC, and her passion and her interest is in coalition building. And there's nothing more central to successful blockchain implementation than building coalitions. And so that was the start of a very long and fruitful professional relationship that Kirsten and I have worked on. Started together a couple of implementation projects, some blockchain governance work, and also she is the co-chair of P2145, which is the IEEE working group for blockchain governance standards. So I'm thrilled to be able to work with Kirsten anytime I get the chance to, and today is one of those days.
Right back at you.
And I feel like I may have segued into our intros already, Rami. I'm sorry if I've jumped the gun on the agenda.
Oh, no worries. You took care of it for me. Yeah, we can go ahead and get started whenever Thomas, you and Kirsten are ready. We can go ahead and get started. Thanks for everyone for joining. This is part 1 of 3 for our series, and we're excited to hear our presenters. By all means, please go ahead and start.
And I think I've got the ball in terms of sharing slides, so let me pull that up. Yes, maybe, no. Yes, there it is. I just have to find.
And Thomas and Kirsten, if you guys are okay with it, are you guys okay with people jumping in and asking questions if they have one?
Most certainly.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah,
right. I know sometimes on the webinar functions we end up having where, you know, questions have to go into the chat box or the Q&A section. So with this being a more meeting setup, I figured that wouldn't be a massive issue.
I think we'll be great with interaction and a sort of semi-casual approach here. Because honestly, folks, if you get your answer that you need here, then we've succeeded. And if you walk away with no answers for what you really need, then we failed. But only you can tell us what your question was. So it's on you to get what you need, and it's on us to supply the need. And in service of that, this is our intro screen, of course. We're using a tool called Slido, which I've become very fond of. And what I would encourage everyone on the call to do is grab your cell phone camera and point it at that QR code on the right, or just open a browser tab in your desktop machine and go to slido.com and put in 127749. And when you do that, I will do it myself right now. Point the camera at the QR code, pause a moment, wait for the camera to prompt me with a URL, which is the URL in the lower right corner. And it should very quickly launch Slido. It should look very much like there's nothing going on yet, which is correct. But now there's something going on. So I'd like you to please obviously get into Slido. The QR code is still there. Slido.com is there on the left. The magic number is there. Yeah, rate your own knowledge of blockchain and distributed ledger technology, where 1 is you're a novice, 5 is you're an expert, and whatever's true for you. And you can actually edit your response. So if you pick a number, you're like, that's not quite it. And we've got, let's see, out of 19 participants, we have 9 people have participated. Thank you all. I'm including myself. I had to give myself a 4 out of 5 because there's so many people who know so much more than I do, even though I've been doing this full time for the better part of 3 years.
Everyone has room to grow.
I sure think so. 11 out of 19. We're getting there, folks. Quite the spectrum too. That's a broad array of scores. And definitely trending.
We're feeling confident today. I like it.
Well, one of the 5s went away before, which is not an unreasonable thing. Let's give it another minute. The slide is going to come in handy later on as well. So I'm going to really encourage folks to go ahead and pull out the phone or open the spare browser tab and fire that up. How about when I get to 13 responses, I'll go to the next slide. I'll use a little blackmail on the audience. What this is telling me is that we're going to have a mix of folks who are really just very curious about blockchain in general, and slightly more folks who have some solid grounding in blockchain and are ready for some more depth, which is a terrific combination. I think we're going to learn from each other. There's 12, one more, folks. I trust you know there is no one right answer. So yeah, I gave myself a 4. Kirsten, how'd you rate yourself?
I gave myself a 4 as well.
Good. That's how I would have rated you. One of the especially on the implementation end. Shall I hold out for 13 or shall I surrender? What do you think?
I think we can surrender for now.
All right, fine. We got 12 people who absolutely know how to connect to Slido and can answer the further questions that come later down in the presentation. So Kirsten, talk to us about this DLT thing.
Yeah, so of course, today's lecture is about blockchain's implications for enterprises and for business in general. But of course, to answer that question, we really need to figure out first, what exactly is DLT? What is blockchain? And it's a very, very exciting question to ask, especially for us tech nerds in the room. I know I definitely consider myself one. But to folks that aren't as technically inclined, it could also be a little bit of a scary question because, there's a lot of misconceptions about the complex nature of distributed ledger technology. So I thought that I would start with a very, very high level explanation. Would you mind? Thank you, Thomas. So distributed ledger technology, distributed networks, these concepts have been around for a while. So the first distributed ledger technology, the first blockchain that ever came to existence formally was Bitcoin. So since then, that was about a little over a decade ago now that Bitcoin came out. Since then, we have seen this technology absolutely explode. I believe we're in a Cambrian explosion of blockchain technology right now. And over here, we have a brief explanation of distributed networks versus some other varieties of networks. So of course, traditionally, a lot of softwares, governing structures, businesses have had very centralized natures. We ended up evolving into some more decentralized networks over time, and blockchain is true distributed network. So that's tens of nodes, hundreds of nodes, thousands of nodes, depending on the network, over the world, over a region. That is how these technologies are maintained. So moving over to the difference between blockchain and DLT, we use this example of a square and a rectangle. Every blockchain is a DLT, but not every DLT is a blockchain. So I've included a couple of examples of DLTs that are not blockchains up here, Hedera and Radix. There are, of course, plenty of blockchains out there. For example, Hyperledger, Corda, EOS, Ethereum, we could go on. And depending on your use case, one could be more valuable than the other. That will get into the nitty-gritty details that we'll be handling in subsequent lectures. So moving on, Thomas, thank you. So blockchain is really, really fantastic at achieving a few things. So it is particularly valuable when you need to transfer data or share data amongst multiple parties. So this could be really fantastic for supply chain, custody of objects, reconciliation, etc. And this is really the reason why we've seen so many like consortium style blockchains evolve in the business space. Would you mind shifting, Thomas? Thank you. So there, especially as of like a few years ago, have been plenty of companies trying to implement blockchain technology in a silo. So just as a sole maintainer of a blockchain. And unfortunately, what we've come to realize over time is that's not really the way to get the most value out of blockchain technology. If you are, an individual company and you want to store data on a single node that you maintain or a few nodes that you maintain, you might as well just be using a database. At that point, blockchain is essentially just a very expensive and difficult to maintain database.
Yes.
So yeah, blockchain, when it comes to the real value add of blockchain technology, you need to have networks of multiple parties that are interchanging information, that are relying on a single source of truth. And we will get into a couple of fantastic examples of this very shortly.
Right. So I want to pause and ask folks here on the Slido app, which you should still have on your phone or in that browser tab, which type of questions are you trying to get answers to? There are 4 types: type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. A type 1 question is, what can blockchain do for me? Or what is a cool thing a blockchain might do? And that's the kind of early question that's and by the way, you can pick more than one. Whatever's true for you. I think I've got it set up to allow you to do multiple. Yeah, up to 2. And, there's some value to that, isn't there, right? Figuring out like, wow, what might it do is the necessary precursor question to any further question. A type 2 question is, well, so how can I make blockchain work, or how can I make it work for me, or how do I build this blockchain solution? So it's much more pragmatic. You've gotten past coolness into trying to make the coolness work for you. Type 3 question is, how do I make my blockchain application work better? So I've got something running and I'm optimizing it, I'm adding features, I'm trying to make it better, cooler, whatever. Then a type 4 question is, yeah, I'm going to be able to take my blockchain infrastructure for granted, and I want to build some additional thing on top of that, like a blockchain as a service situation, where I want to find the next thing to add. And some of you will recognize the sequence as corresponding to the 4 sections of a Wordley map, where innovation is on the left edge, and people are like, oh, look, automobiles. Someday everyone will own an automobile. And everyone's, no, my horse is fine. Why do I need an automobile? In the early days of technology are dominated by the coolness and the wonder. And they make way fairly quickly, well, depends on how quickly the innovation spreads, into these type 2 and then type 3 and finally type 4 questions. And we have a mix. 9 folks have responded, and I would call that good enough. I think I'm getting a sense for where people are at. So one way to understand how distributed ledger technology solutions can help you is to look at specific examples of how they're helping other people right now. So let's say making complex transactions easier. There's dozens, hundreds of examples. The one I'm choosing to share with you is called Coadjute, which is based on R3 Corda. It's one of the very few solutions I'm aware of that's built on Corda. Corda has not been as widely utilized as Ethereum, but it's got a lot of advantages. The Coadjute solution was actually rolled out as a blockchain as a service rather than a consortium approach, which I think was rather clever of them. What that means is, instead of trying to get a bunch of stakeholders in an industry to all agree to build to a common center, which can take a lot of time, what Coadjute did was build a service, go to the software providers in the UK home purchase world, people who provide software to home brokers and mortgage lenders and banks and all the people who are in title companies, and integrate with their software and get the software vendors to run the nodes. So it's a shared source of truth, not controlled by any one person, including not controlled by Coadjute. But because it integrates with existing software, the end user has barely any learning curve. And what the users love is that instead of getting hundreds of thousands of consumer phone calls every year asking like, what's the status of my purchase? And who has the latest document? And has it been signed yet? And on and on and on. they pool the data. There's a single shared source of truth managed by multiple parties. Every transaction, every home purchase gets its own special chat room with messaging about that transaction, documents about that transaction. And it dramatically reduces the complexity and the, who's got which action now. Wait, did you send the contract to Fred to get signed? I thought he signed it. He told me he signed it. Did he mail it to you? It's all gone. It's all gone. It's all right there in the portal, ready to be seen. Here's another example, Interx. Grant Thornton is a large international accountancy, and they work with a lot of multinational firms. Now, multinational firms, not to feel too much sorrow for them, but they have some real struggles. One of which is you got, say, dozens or hundreds of divisions, each has their own ERP system, and you are subject to strict regulations in terms of when Division A sells widgets to Division B to use in some assembly that Division B is going to make. Well, of course, they have to buy from A because they're part of the same parent company. You don't not work with your sibling divisions, but you have to charge a fair market price or the World Trade Organization is going to come sanction you. And so 9 months from now, someone's going to come along and say, yeah, 9 months ago, you did this transaction with diodes. Prove you didn't break the rules. And you're like, I've got 2 different ERP systems. I have to go send a team now to forensically dig through these incompatible systems to answer this question. It's pretty hideous. So what they built was a blockchain backbone where every time an ERP transaction crosses boundaries and shows up on 2 different ERPs, it also shows up in this backbone that links them. And instead of having to reconcile when somebody asks you a hard question or once a month or whatever, they literally continuously reconcile the systems moment by moment. It's audit ready at any time. I saw a demo for it. It was mind-blowing. A lot of us didn't even know that the problem existed. I didn't until they unveiled the solution to it. And as I say, it really manages the complexity of multiple data sources having to be integrated and being reconciled in a beautiful way.
Indeed. And if you think transactions across international divisions of a single company is complex, imagine you are, Maersk, and you're dealing with literally hundreds of thousands of individual freight companies and ports and middlemen and governments, and a majority of them are still using paper.
Yes.
Paper bill of landings, paper tracking, and the supply chain is completely opaque. So a few years back, Maersk made a really big announcement. They announced that they were creating this platform called TradeLens, which they wanted to onboard as many of their partners, port operators, logistics companies as possible to use this blockchain-based logistics management platform. And even though they had some, hiccups initially, where there was a little bit of lack of interest from major port operators due to some governance concerns, which we'll actually address in the next lecture, this consortium-based blockchain has seen a lot of success over the past few years, and has probably honestly grown to be one of the most successful, at least in impact, quantity of transactions, quantity of members, consortium blockchain that we've seen to date. So
I would add that part of what makes it kind of mind-blowing is if you send a container from Europe to America or wherever, it'll change custody, like who's responsible for it, 17 times on average, from a freight forwarder to a 3PL to a trucker who is actually a subcontractor to somebody else. And at any given moment, you're like, who has this thing? Where is it? What's its status? In the paper-based world, the answer could be, we don't know, we'll get back to you in a few months. And now they know the answer within seconds. So it's a dramatic improvement in quality, in safety, and certainty about where your stuff is. It's a huge improvement.
Absolutely. So the numbers along the side are some stats that I've pulled for you. So as of this month, they have 4 of the 5 largest global port operators on board, 150 member companies thus far, and 10 government agencies that have signed up to work with Maersk's platform. So in addition to this, they have a large number of companies that are maintaining nodes for the network, and they have an operating governance for this consortium blockchain network as well. So this is just a really, really incredible example of what blockchain can do for supply chains.
Yes. By the way, folks, if you have questions, you'll find that there is a Q&A section in the Slido app. And you can feel free to put a question in there or stick it in chat or just unmute yourself and say, hey, Kirsten, hey, Thomas. We're happy to take your questions. Another useful DLT use case has to do with identity management. There was an outfit called CU Ledger, had a product. They renamed themselves Bonafide recently. That's a play on the word bona fide or bona fide. It was a credit union customer identity mobile app. The problem with identifying yourself to your service provider is your bank, your credit union, whoever it is, has to have all this secret data on you so that when you call or someone calls pretending to be you, they can say, well, what was your mom's maiden name? And, at what branch did you open your account? All kinds of stuff that in theory only you would know, except they have to then have a copy of all the data, and then they get hacked. And then the hackers take all the data about you, your mother's maiden name, everything else, and they sell it to people out there in the world who then pretend to be you and steal your credit and steal your assets. It's messy. So how do you do identity management without creating honeypots of personal data? And there's a technique using something called verifiable credentials, which has a blockchain data storage component that they've created and put into action as a simple mobile phone app where you walk up to the bank teller and the teller says, okay, are you standing in front of a teller right now? And your phone asks you, are you standing in front of a teller right now? And then you say yes, and the teller looks in her system and sees that your verifiable credential just acknowledged the challenge that you are in fact standing in front of a teller. Now, if you're sitting at home and your phone says, are you standing in front of a teller? The answer would be no, you're at home, and someone's trying to steal your identity. And so the attempted fraud would fail. There's a lot of interesting moving parts beneath the surface. And you'll see a similar set of solutions from the self-sovereign identity movement, from Microsoft's Ion product, and a fairly new thing from IBM called decentralized identity. It's an alpha product recently released. So you're going to see a lot more of this happening out there in the world. And that includes things like credentialing doctors, getting people, say, certificates when somebody like Justin has experience in enterprise architecture and someone wants to hire him, says, well, what's the proof you actually have this experience? He could have a certificate signed by a past employer attesting to his skill at some skill set. And that follows the worker around. So you don't have to keep demonstrating your skill. You've got the credentials that'll do that. There's a lot of different ways this is going to play out in the next few years.
So this next topic is very fascinating for folks that have been paying attention to the news as of the past 6 months. So NFTs were featured on SNL and have been in all the major news publications. But what I'm here to tell you today is they're not all what the hype tells you. So NFTs are essentially just unique tokens stored in a blockchain. That actual token itself can contain any sort of piece of data. It could contain a JPEG or a GIF, like many of the art NFTs that we've seen in the media, but it could also contain information on an automotive part or a banana that moves along a supply chain. So similar to how, like, for example, blockchain can be used for logistics, you could also use NFT technology on the blockchain to create representations of physical objects and then track the custody of those objects through space. So as far as the like digital collectible and art space, I'll share a little bit about that first, and then I'll move into digital twins and some of the benefits of NFT technology for manufacturing and logistics. So the benefit of NFT technology for things like digital art is it is provably unique. So if an artist, say we have a modern Monet, wants to create a digital version of a piece of their art, individuals in the community can verify that it was coming from the original artist's address that they publicly disclose, and that it is indeed an authentic piece. So as far as business applications of this technology go on the collectible space, there have been a lot of, say, major baseball card manufacturers or other collectible asset companies that have been moving to using NFT technology to create digital versions of those collectible assets. So it's a very, very booming space right now. Then moving to the uses of NFTs in manufacturing and logistics. Anyone who is in manufacturing has probably heard of digital twins. So these are essentially, even without blockchain technology, digital twins have been in implementation for a while, but it's essentially having every piece that is created by a company, say in a manufacturing line. You have each of those pieces have a digital representation. And as the pieces move along the manufacturing line or are composed with other pieces, a computer software will track what exactly happens to the piece. You'll oftentimes have IoT devices that look at the pieces and try to analyze, okay, does this have any sort of defect? What's the extent of the defect, et cetera? And in addition to that, these can be used, the digital twins can be used for the actual logistics of the end product as well. So NFTs are bringing the verifiability aspect to the existing digital twins industry. Even though digital twins have been around for a while, like I said, they didn't have that verifiable uniqueness that blockchain provides. So many companies are moving in that direction as well.
So Justin had a question. Do you have knowledge of, or can you speak to NFTs used to prove ownership of IP or copyright?
That's actually a really interesting question. I wrote an article about that a few weeks ago.
Nice.
So in the U.S., at least, or many in many nations, IP is very, very heavily regulated, and of course, you have a governing body proving that, or basically like the government in many countries says who owns something and who does not. So any NFT that represents IP would have to have some sort of capacity to communicate to the government upon the transfer of that NFT, the new owner of that IP, which makes things very complex. We have not seen a platform successfully implement anything like that yet. I'm personally of the belief that this will be possible in the future, and it could significantly streamline the transfer of IP ownership or copyright, specifically looking at royalties, because of course, non-fungible tokens have royalties baked into them, oftentimes as long as you design them to be so. Royalties that give the originator a percent of future transactions or a percent of, say, the value that's created off of that NFT, which is completely aligned with modern IP practice. So long story short, I think in the future, yes, but right now I have not seen any implementation that has successfully facilitated IP transfer with NFTs.
And Justin, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask follow-up questions or let us know if that addressed your question, we'd love to.
Oh, no, that absolutely addressed it. I thank you very much. If we could actually, or if you could send a link to that article, I'd love to read it more in depth.
Will do. I'll send it in chat.
Thank you.
Super. And when we send out the recording and the slides, we'll make sure to include that as well. Cool. I will mark that as complete. Go back to the deck. One of the things I want to kind of drill down, I think we're running well for time, and I think this deserves some attention. So you might think, well, okay, so I'm building a car and I've got a digital twin of the car, which is just this electronic representation of the car. Like, so what? And the reason you would do a so what on that is, as you're building the car, you could, in some companies are doing this now, here is the fuel injector assembly, and it has an identity, and it went into a particular car. And that fuel injector assembly contained parts from specific vendors, and those might have serial numbers on them. And then a vendor might send out a recall saying, oh, lot 87 of our fuel injector ports, there's a problem with them. And you don't want to have to recall thousands and thousands of vehicles because some of them might have the defective port. You just want to get the specific vehicles, the specific assemblies. You don't want, it's the same problem we see with the Food Trust Network, which is a Walmart creation, also with IBM, much like Maersk was. In Food Trust, you can have a recall of, a certain farm discovered that some of their cabbage has got a bacterial infection that can make you sick. And so we need to recall that batch of cabbages. And if you can't tell very, very quickly, so where are those specific cabbages out there in the world, you end up throwing out 10 or 100 or 1,000 times as many perfectly good cabbages because you can't be sure. And so better safe than sorry. And so we waste tons of food because we haven't kept track of where things came from. But with Food Trust, you can look at a particular case. You can scan the barcode. The system will tell you what truck it was on, what warehouse it went through, what farm it came from. And if a farm issues a recall, you can send a note out and hit those cases in those warehouses and at those retail locations. And only the affected items have to be pulled off the shelf. So it dramatically increases food safety while reducing waste. So the whole digital twin thing has got a ton of interesting, virtuous knock-on effects. Another one has to do with recycling. Right now, if you want to recycle an LCD monitor, an LED monitor, or a plasma monitor, they're made very, very differently one from the next. Even the same model will have different internal behaviors. They'll locate different components in different places. Certain components have materials in them that can or can't be recycled or might be toxic and need to be handled differently. And when it comes time to do the what we call recycling is really a controlled disassembly and of this complex electronic thing, and figure out which items can and should go into a landfill, which can be chopped up and melted and put back into raw materials, which things can be handled in some other fashion. And it's like a mystery what's in there unless you have a digital twin from the manufacturer out on a blockchain somewhere where anyone can access it and say, well, here's the serial number on this monitor. Zap, oh, here's the parts breakdown. Here's a little video of how to disassemble it. Oh, here's a highlights which things are toxic and which things have to go get special treatment and which things can be recycled in a simple fashion. That lack of information has dramatically held back the ability of people to do proper electronics recycling in the world. And that lack is coming to an end because of things like digital twins and long-term blockchain storage of the parts explosion and so forth. Justin is adding something. It applies to produce and human consumable products. At least once a year, there's a recall for E. coli or some other contaminant. Why not the US FDA using a blockchain-based seed-to-table solution? And I think the answer is the government is the last to adopt these things. It's probably just as well, frankly, let private enterprise spend private dollars making a bunch of things that don't work until we find one that does, and then it becomes widespread and ubiquitous, and then it's time to standardize on it. That's my belief. Right now, the government just mandates that if there's a problem, you have to take appropriate steps. And it's the private enterprise desire to not waste stuff and save money that's driving the innovation. I think you'll see the FDA mandating that in the next decade, maybe the next even few years. And there's more chat comments. Let me track that. Justin and I are in violent agreement here. Anything else, Kirsten, you wanted to mention on the digital collectibles and digital twins? I know there's a lot we could say.
I know there's so much in that space. I think I've given a good overview though.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Let's see what we have for folks next. Speeding up international transactions, a few years ago, this was exciting. Nowadays, I think it's so clear and obvious and well known for most people, I guess. But I'll mention, I had a person I was working with in China, in Shanghai, worker, and I would every month send her salary equivalent. She was a contractor, but we had an agreement on a base monthly salary. And one month I tried sending it as a bank transfer, and it was nightmarish. I had to set up an international wire, and I had to go get some forms from my bank and fill them out. And then it didn't work because of something my bank said that wasn't correct. So I had to resubmit it. And it ended up taking the better part of a week, at least 5 business days. And the fees on it approached like 1 or 2%. That's why I was, sending, no, it's more than that. I was sending like $1,000, and it was over $50, $60 in fees. And I'm like, I don't want to do that every month. What a pain. Even if it got smoother, it would still be awkward and slow. And so I asked her if she would take a cryptocurrency payment. And she said, sure. And that took about 5 minutes. And I think my fees were like less than $1.
Yep.
So the difference in difficulty and complexity and unpleasantness in certain kinds of international transactions is massive. We're seeing this with credit notes now. We're seeing this with supply chain trade. A lot of folks are cluing into the fact that a distributed ledger, either the transaction's not on it or it's on it everywhere. And so there's no like, I have to reconcile my ledger with your ledger. There's just the one shared ledger. And so it's hard to go back once you've seen how wonderful this can be. You can still make mistakes, but at least everyone sees the same mistake. And the questions come up. Ben asks, how does consensus work for enterprise blockchains? Do all the nodes of the network have to confirm transactions, or only the parties involved have to confirm? It depends on which technology you're using. So for something like EOSIO, which is what I cut my teeth on, you would just have everything behind a VPN. You'd have a certain number of people running nodes, and the classic setup is 2/3 plus 1 of the nodes have to agree for it to be final, but that's actually configurable. You could have it force unanimity, but that might be a mistake if someone goes down for maintenance. You might require 9 out of 10 or what have you. The consensus is usually not the sticking point on enterprise blockchains like it is in a public chain like Bitcoin or Ethereum, where there can be game theory efforts to, how do I put this nicely, steal stuff from people. Enterprise blockchains, all the actors are known, all the actors are identified. They're given credentials by their enterprises, and so it's pretty clear whose fingerprints are on what. And because the consensus effort is much more controlled, it's a lot faster. So you're never going to see proof of work in enterprise blockchain. It's always going to be proof of stake or proof of authority or proof of time or one of the other inexpensive proof mechanisms. Basically, for most people doing the design work, you're looking for what's a productive development environment, and does the consensus mechanism seem to work? Okay, fine. And then you never have to rip it out and replace it. You never even have to worry about it. It becomes one of these components you don't care about. Similar to what is the IP transport protocol on your network card? It's like, there's people who care, I'm not one of them. Not sure, Ben, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that did. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Kind of a follow-up.
Yeah, please.
I don't know if you both mentioned this earlier, but like, would the private blockchain be shared between different companies, or is it just different business units in a company?
It depends on what you're trying to do. Often it's different companies, but it could be, for a Grant Thornton Interx, it might just be divisions of a large multinational, or it might be a combination. But anytime you either don't have like some master entity that you all are being forced to trust, or you just like, I don't want to have to fight over what reality is. Let's just spin up a blockchain and give everyone credentials and run it. And then if you don't sign it if you don't mean it, because once you sign it and stick it on chain, everyone gets a copy. Kirsten has
Yeah.
something to add.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that in addition to companies or divisions of a single company, oftentimes regulators can also be involved depending on the industry.
Oh, right, yeah.
So, well, I mean, I guess this would depend on the technology, but is there like an immutability factor, or if regulators are involved, do they have the ability to go back and change transactions? Or
Oh God, no. No,
So
all your
there's actually a really interesting underlying question there, though. So with very, very highly distributed blockchain networks like Ethereum, for example, it's extremely difficult, highly improbable for anyone to ever have the ability to rewrite a transaction. However, if you say have a blockchain that is technically inside of one company and it is 10 different legally incorporated entities under one umbrella that each maintain a node, theoretically, they could all collude and yes, rewrite transactions. Of course, that would be defeating the purpose of them building this blockchain network to begin with.
and if the regulator is operating a node, it'll all be visible to the regulator.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. More likely, what you're going to do is you'll just maintain the blockchain, and if there's some problem that needs fixing, or like, oh wait, someone fat fingered an entry and we've actually got an error on chain, you just put in a new transaction saying, oh yeah, that transaction a week ago, it was wrong. Here's the new transaction, signed by me, co-signed by my supervisor. Oops, sorry. That happens in accounting all the time, right? When you close out January's books and February's gone by, and then in March you're like, oops, problem in January, dude. You don't reopen January typically. You put in a correcting transaction in March that references January. So it's not like we're having to invent new things here.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So yes, speeding up international transactions. I think we're all going to be spoiled soon. And this idea of it taking 5 business days and, 3-5% fees and things kicked back from banks and transfers getting lodged halfway through. It's like, well, it left our bank, but it hasn't arrived at her bank. And it seems to be at a bank in the middle somewhere. And we're tracking it down now. Like, no, stop. It's nonsense. This may be one of my favorites. It combines 3D printing and intellectual property rights. One of the downsides of the digital revolution is if I make something digital and send it out into the world, it's hard for me to control it after that. Let's say I design a really cool, fuel injection port. We used that example earlier. Great, I'm an engineer, I designed this really cool port, and then it gets out there in the world and my name might be on it. Maybe it's digitally signed, but I can't prevent someone from printing that design. And so it's hard to get paid. So what you can do is set up a closed garden, and this is what Veripart does. They're working with, I want to pronounce it Moog. I think they pronounce it Mog. I don't know. If there's an employee from Moog or Mog on the call, they can correct me. I'll call it Moog. So Air New Zealand sees they need a part. There's a business class passenger, the seat, there's a problem with the entertainment console, and it's like there's a bracket, and they're like, we'll have to not have anyone in that seat on the flight back, and we'll lose thousands of dollars of revenue. And so in the air, they'll say, hey, is there a part in LAX for this? And they say, yeah, no, there's not. Because these planes have a gazillion parts. If you had 8 extra of every part, you'd have a nightmarish logistics problem. Not to mention a massive amount of capital tied up in parts you don't necessarily need. So what will happen is Air New Zealand says, hey, we need the part. Moog can download the part spec from ST Engineering using a blockchain where they sign their request and they are authorized to print 1 copy. And there's a 3D printer that's got an IoT devices in it, and it's on the blockchain, and it says, I'm being authorized to print this part. It prints the part. It says, I printed exactly 1 part. They pay the engineering firm their fee. They deliver the part to LAX, and the Air New Zealand folks stick it on the plane when it lands. Notice there was no packaging required. They didn't have to warehouse lots and lots of parts. They didn't have to move parts through customs. So the idea of printing 3D parts when you need them from data plus raw materials is kind of wild. It changes your logistics supply chain dramatically. especially in, by the way, the armed forces. The US Department of the Navy is all over this whole 3D printing thing, and they're using blockchain technology and IoT devices to control the dissemination and use of the digital description of the part. Now, that's not to say that stuff can't leak off chain somehow, and I don't know how they control for that, but you get the idea that this is a problem space being addressed. Okay, next question. We've talked about a bunch of different use cases, and we'd like to know which of these is most interesting to you. And I already jumped in and gave my answer. And just, pick your top 1, 2, or 3. We have one more Slido question for you after this one, but we definitely want to see what you guys have to say and have to think. And we've got some cool chat going on, so I'll pull that up as well. Let's see. Oh, Christine Fahey has got some additional backstory for us on what's going on food safety. Apparently, Frank Yanis led food safety for Walmart, is now working at the FDA. He's leading the charge there. So that's certainly a pleasant and reassuring fact. Also, Christine gives the place where you can go to grab other recordings in this series from Blockchain 901, our hosts. Great, so we've got 11 responses from our 17 participants. One more, 2 more. I think the identity management one seems to be pretty popular. It's one of my choices. Supply chain traceability, coordination of data, 3D printing, digital collectibles, and financial services. By the way, we'll all end up using blockchain-based financial service infrastructure, and none of us will know it, because it'll just be hiding behind the scenes. It'll just be beautiful and transparent, and faster, cheaper, better. Well, faster and better anyway. One can hope for cheaper. But, let's just say I don't have a lot of faith in the financial services sector. Any thoughts from you, Kirsten, on this? What did you end up picking?
So I tried to pick 4, and it would only let me pick 3.
Correct.
So the ones that I chose were supply chain, traceability, NFTs, of course, and financial services. I would say the most influential one, if that was the metric I was going on, as opposed to coolness factor, would probably be financial services. Like you said,
Yes.
It's going to be absolutely revolutionary. There's no way that I foresee traditional banking continuing with its current technology. Like that, that's not to say they're going to be made obsolete by blockchain or cryptocurrencies. That is saying that they would be leveraging that technology to achieve their, deliverables.
Yeah, I would point out, for instance, that the one of the biggest money makers for, gosh, I think it's Morgan Stanley or one of the other big ones, is being a middle person for debt. When municipalities want to sell a bond and bond buyers want to buy that bond, there's always, in traditional finance, some person sitting in the middle who makes sure everybody is who they say they are, and they take a modest fee, which amounts to billions and billions of dollars in fees. Just so you have a willing buyer and a willing seller who want to have a transaction. And you could do the exact same thing on a Coinbase or a Kraken or a blockchain-based distributed ledger run by a nonprofit consortium of borrowers or buyers, essentially for pennies. And those billions of dollars in fees may or may not be justified by the old risk model, but they're not going to be justified in the new. And I think you're going to see more and more alternatives, whether it's crowdsourcing, low-cost platforms for clearing that kind of willing buyer, willing seller settlement. Finance is going to be quietly revolutionized. I look forward to seeing how that plays out. Let's see. Got a note from Justin. The Federal Reserve announced in October of 2019 they had an active research investigation going, creating a tandem USD digital token. Yeah, central bank digital currencies are a big deal. We didn't get into that. I barely understand them, even though I was part of a research group that gave a report to the Bank of England last summer. The Chinese are creating a digital yuan, which will allow them, the way they're designing it is they will know exactly who in the entire country has exactly how many yuan, dollars, whatever currency, in their wallet at any time, and who bought what from whom. And if you, let's say your social credit score, you become socially undesirable because you protested in favor of democracy in Hong Kong. Oh, well, we'll just take your money. We'll freeze your account. And instead of having to go through like a court order and some sort of, justification process, and someone at the bank has to go in and do something to your account, boom, central bank. This does it. It's going to be wacky and wild and potentially very dangerous.
Another interesting aspect of China's CBDC is they are also imploring like trade partners. So for example, Chinese-owned ports in Portugal or any of the other hundreds of companies where China owns ports or toll roads, et cetera. Those ports and toll roads, I read recently, are going to be using the digital yuan. And of course, like the barrier to entry for setting up an account and transacting in digital yuan is very low. So I imagine, will be quite easy to onboard local people in these various places to using it. And I'm just thinking, well, on one hand, that is just so intelligent because it preserves the value of the yuan. If you have so many people globally leveraging it in order to access these very important ports and roads in their nation. So it's a very, very well thought out project, to say the least.
And more than a little disturbing. One of the things that's also going to happen, by the way, a little global trend for you. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency for decades. That's probably going to end in the next decade or two, either in favor of a basket of currencies or the Chinese currency. And when that happens, I'm not qualified to tell you all of the knock-on effects. Let's just say there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects, and many of them will not be pleasant for Americans. But that may be outside the scope of today's talk. So let's talk about here. Let's wrap up with, what does this all mean for you? I would say it means these things. Your industry is going to change. You may or may not notice it depending on what level of abstraction it happens, if it's under the covers or it's in your face. Blockchain and distributed ledgers will be present. They won't always be visible. Most likely they'll be used most visibly to handle what I call the complex multi-party hairballs, that are the tangled mess transactions that everybody hates in your industry, but they don't seem to know how to fix. A great example is in pharmaceutical distribution, there are cases where hospitals are providing pharmaceuticals to smaller organizations under very complex contractual arrangements involving special pricing, and the price gets recalculated at the end of the year based on the total volume that year. Oh, but wait, there was a special discount in August. And it takes a team of lawyers to go through the records and figure out what was the price supposed to be at the end. It's wasteful to try to figure out what just happened and what it means and what contract terms should apply when it could all be calculated if only you just put it into a smart contract, which is what's happening. So that's an effort underway by Chronicled, who also brought us MetaLedger. You'll see that DLTs thin the barriers between organizations. It's no longer going to be the case where my company ships you something and we say, ah, you received it. And you look in your records and you say, I have no record of receiving it. And we can't both be right. but I'll just stand by my system, you stand by your system, and we fight about it. If we have a DLT, we've got one system. And if it says you got it, then you got it. If it says you didn't get it, then you didn't get it. And I might not like that answer, but I don't get to fight with you about what the truth is. I have to fight over what to do about the truth. And that's going to be a little different. And this also brings up, in my opinion, the need for psychological safety, because if people are currently maintaining their psychological safety by withholding information and saying, well, that's not what my system says, and we take that away from them, an abusive boss will just use a single shared source of truth as a new way to beat people up. And that's going to hurt morale and it's going to hurt adoption. So we need people who live in those environments. That kind of toxic boss needs to be exposed and rehabilitated or replaced. And if they aren't, it's going to slow down adoption, or those companies will be the last to adopt and they might go out of business. So that's what I mean by the need for psychological safety. Final question. This is a one-word answer. Just tell us, what did you most like about today's talk?
I liked how you gave me a very kind introduction, Thomas. Thank you for that.
Well, you could put Thomas's kindness, if you like, in the word
And
cloud.
Great questions. Lots of great audience questions.
Great audience questions. Yeah, really some terrific interactions. Oh, looks like examples.
Wow, an exclamation mark in there. We're doing well, Thomas.
Hey, we're getting punctuation. It's a good sign. And because it's a word cloud, if you use the same word somebody else used, it shows up bigger rather than multiple times. Ooh, someone thought we were easy to understand. That's awesome. Thank you.
If anyone thinks we were difficult to understand, please let us know.
That. Yes,
we could always do better.
You can tell us in chat rooms. One thing that you should also know, by the way, while you're letting us know what you like most about today's talk, is that next week we're going to talk about something that builds on this week. Kirsten, would you care to give a quick overview of next week?
Yeah, absolutely. So next week, we're going to be talking about a topic that we think is one of the most important and most under-recognized topics as far as preparing to build blockchain systems, especially for enterprises, and that is blockchain governance. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into what exactly is governance, what do you need to get right before you start having conversations of governance, and at the end, we'll give you a little bit of a toolbox that you can take off and apply to your projects that you're analyzing or considering working on.
Super. Also in chat, I should mention that we had a, let's see, would you agree or disagree that the use and implementation of oracles is key to shipping, logistics, and so forth? Yeah, we didn't get into that much, and it's a very good point. So the Oracle Corporation is a software company that makes databases. I used to work there, but oracles in a blockchain or DLT context means something different. I really wish the industry had picked a different word because of the overlap, but a blockchain oracle is just an external source of data that the blockchain accepts as truthful. The thing about blockchains is they only know what you tell them. They don't have eyes and ears. They don't have sensors of any kind. They just store what they're told. And so let's say you've got an insurance product that pays out when someone's flight is delayed. It might sit there and listen to a data feed from the Federal Aviation Administration on flight delays. So in that case, the FAA acts as the oracle, the external data source that comes in and is treated as true by the blockchain. And of course, if you wanted to hack that, you would buy expensive policies. And you would have your confederate at the FAA pollute the FAA data feed with false data. It's like, oh, it's a bug. And the FAA's got no skin in the game, right? They're not getting paid for that. It's just public data. And as long as you're not caught, you can't play that game more than once or twice and it would be fraud. But, maybe you could make a few bucks. Not that I'm recommending it. But that's the problem with oracles is if the oracle lies to your blockchain has no way of defending itself. You can only build in things like safeguards and panic buttons and dead man switches and other ways to have people challenge data that comes in that might be serving somebody's interest but might not be technically true. So yeah, oracles are definitely one of the curious spots for blockchain. And on that note, I think we're out of time. Closing thoughts, Kirsten, or should we hand it back to Reminder?
I just wanted to thank you all for coming. We always enjoy talking to, bright folks excited about blockchain, and hopefully you learned something.
Yeah, and we look forward to connecting with you and seeing you next week. And if we can help you in any way, just let us know. Rami, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas and Kirsten. That was great. And yes, as Thomas said, we'll see everyone back here next week for part 2. Thank you all.